And now I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Michael Noble. As I mentioned, he's the chair of our task force, and he's going to talk a little bit about the task force. Thank you, Michael.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for a great kickoff, and want to say officially welcome to this webinar. We have a very special guest that I'm excited to introduce here, but just want to give you a quick overview of our task force. So I'm Michael Noble, as Melissa mentioned, the chair of this amazing task force comprised of incredible individuals with a wide variety of skills, experiences, backgrounds, and whatnot. And what they bring to the table for all of you guys is really the best sort of tips and insights and information and knowledge. We're all about sharing the knowledge around accessibility and inclusivity within the workplace. And we try to help host various webinars throughout the year, just like this one. So if you haven't signed up, make sure you give us your email address so you can be aware of all the webinars that this task force puts on. We're also on LinkedIn. We just created a new LinkedIn page. So if you just search for the exact same name of this task force, you can follow all of our latest updates. So just want to say thank you again for joining us. And as I mentioned, our goal is to really help people with hearing loss, their employers and allies, toward more accessible and inclusive workplaces and employment opportunities, so that everyone with a hearing loss, no matter your background or walk of life, you have that career satisfaction and you are set up for success. So just want to say, please feel free to reach out to me or any of these task force members with questions, comments, or suggestions. And then Melissa, if we can go to the next slide. Excellent. So I am absolutely thrilled and honored to introduce you and welcome Andy Chandler. And a little bit about Andy Chandler before we officially have him run through his amazing presentation that I have had the chance to sort of get a sneak peek. It is really phenomenal, so you're in for a treat today. So Andy is an individual with a lifelong hearing loss. He has always been fascinated by technology that helps him to essentially hear better. He was enthralled by the advent of computers and the internet, followed by email, texting, and of course nowadays, captioning apps. But these technologies also introduce risk, making people susceptible to cybercrime. Since 2007, Andy has worked in cybersecurity, helping clients defend against a range of cyber threats. Throughout his career, Andy requested accommodations from the TTY to telecoil, infrared, FM hearing devices to automatic speech recognition and virtual meetings, such as this one. So just a word of caution, while Andy can speak to cybersecurity and requesting accommodations, he is not a lawyer, and he cannot speak authoritatively to the ADA Section 504 or other regulations around accessibility, but who knows, maybe in his next life, as Andy likes to joke. So with that, I want to officially turn it over to you. Andy, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, and we're so excited to hear you present to us. Thank you.
Michael, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it should be wonderful because I wrote it. And thank you all who are joining us this afternoon. As you might be able to tell from my background, I am joining this webinar from the lovely Portland, Maine area. And it's this time of year, it's a wonderful time to be in Maine. Let me start my presentation. And I'm on the wrong screen. There we go. Here we go. As you heard, the title of this webinar is it really a risk? Cybersecurity, accessibility, and the myths that hold us back. I am a so-called cybersecurity professional, but I think what's of more interest to everyone in this webinar today is that I, like many of you, have a hearing loss. I've always worn hearing aids, and about 12 years ago, I got my cochlear implant. Throughout my career, I've had to ask for accommodations, all the way from TTYs to captions in Microsoft Teams. Most of the time, those requests have been granted. However, I did have a challenge in getting CART approved, and I'll talk about that later in this webinar. I could not have put together this presentation without help from my friends. Michael in particular, he's the one that suggested this topic. And in order to put this webinar together, I had to talk to some of my friends who had more experience in certain areas than I did. If any of you are joining this webinar, thank you. Now, before we start talking about accommodations and accessibility, I want to give my standard cyber scam prevention seminar, a sermon as I like to call it. For years, we have seen cyber scams. And there's all different kinds of scams out there, and people will spend a great deal of time trying to explain each scam. Sometimes all this information is overwhelming. But the truth of the matter is a common thing to the vast majority of scams. And if you can recognize that thing, you realize you're the target of a scam. That thing, emotional manipulation. Scammers triggering your emotions. Either by phishing, email, by smishing, by text, and boy, we're getting a lot of smishing texts these days, are we not? Or phone calls. And what they rely on is three key emotions. Fear. Oh no, my grandchild's in jail. Hope. Ooh, maybe if I invest in this crypto investment, I'll have enough funds to pay off my debts and send my kids to college. Or the sense of obligation. Huh, this text says that we used to know each other in high school. I probably should respond. When you get a text that triggers your emotion, the first thing you should ask yourself, is this really true? Are they triggering your sense of fear? Is the IRS really sending the police to your door to arrest you? Or a sense of hope and excitement. Hey, I just won the lottery. Or again, that sense of obligation. Do you really need to tell someone they sent their text to the wrong person? The answer, my friends, is no, no, and no, and no again. Here is the gospel truth when it comes to most scams. If you receive a message that was unexpected and a surprise, and if that message causes a reaction of fear, hope, or obligation, and if the sender is unknown, it's a scam. Plain, simple scam. Now, I've given these similar presentations to hard of hearing groups throughout the country, and I've presented at the HLAA conference the past 2 years and presented again in June. And people ask me, well, what does hearing loss have to do with cybersecurity? Are people with hearing loss targeted by scammers? No, but kind of yes. Let's talk about how it happens. People with hearing loss often experience social isolation and loneliness. I know I have. And it's difficult to keep up with conversations in restaurants, parties, and work events. Just yesterday, I was having lunch with my cyber peers, and after an hour, I just got overwhelmed with fatigue. And we miss important context by not overhearing casual conversations at work. Hearing the company gossip, for example. Or maybe in this cubicle over, they're talking about a project you would like to be involved with. But since you can't eavesdrop, you don't know anything about it. These are all very frustrating experiences. And here's where the risk comes. We are naturally drawn to text-based interactions. Captions, I love my captions. Email, text messages, social media, and meetup sites. Scammers know this, and this is where they find us. Cyber scams do not discriminate, but isolation can increase exposure. That's why awareness is your best form of protection. One of the most common scams are seen these days is job offers. Unsolicited job offers sent via text. I don't know about you folks, but I get a ton of these. And they seem to come from reputable companies because they're using the names of valid organizations, but these are all scams. It's very difficult to find a job these days. especially if you want to work remotely. So when you get a job offer that sounds very promising and allows you to work remotely, wow, you might be tempted to respond. Please don't. Any unsolicited job offer is a scam. Please, please, teach yourself, teach your family that when an unexpected message stirs a strong emotional reaction in you, just stop, breathe, think it through, call a friend if you need to. Whatever you do, don't respond to the message. Okay, thus ends my sermon. Now, let's talk about organization fear and how that fear within companies and organizations may keep you from getting the accommodation that you need. Companies, and the CISO office in particular, lives in fear of cyber attacks. If CISO is a term you've not heard before, it stands for the Chief Information Security Officer. That's the person who heads up the office that designs the security program for your organization. The CISO office, the security office, has to deal with some very serious attacks. One of the most challenging attacks are ransomware attacks. If you're not familiar with what ransomware does, what happens is a criminal organization is managed to get access to a company's network and then freezes everyone out. No one can access the network, they can't log in, they can't do anything. In order to get your network back, you have to either recover from backup, and unfortunately, many organizations do not have a good backup, or pay the ransom, which could be millions of dollars. These ransomware attacks are very damaging to healthcare facilities, particularly hospitals. There was an attack that impacted a hospital chain that had 140 hospitals just last year. As a result of this ransomware attack, patient records could not be accessed, schedules could not be reviewed, and lab results were delayed. In fact, there was at least one tragic case leading to a woman going into a cardiac arrest and dying after waiting 4 hours for lab results. So, not only can these ransomware attacks shut down a network, people can die from it. The other thing that CISOs and security officers have to worry about are the garden variety data breaches, which seem to happen weekly. In fact, just a couple of days ago, I got a notice from a medical practice that I have not been to for over 11 years saying they had a data breach. I'm sure you've received many similar letters, offers for free credit monitoring, and so forth and so on. My question is, why is a medical practice holding on to my records when I haven't been there in 11 years? That's besides the point. The granddaddy of all data breaches is the Equifax data breach from years ago. 143, at least 143 million social security numbers were breached, most likely yours as well. Some organizations also have to worry about nation-state attacks, particularly from China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. We just discovered last year that China has been in our telecommunication systems for at least 2 years. It's been able to access AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, as well as secure government communications. To this day, we do not know if we had successfully kicked the Chinese out of our telecom networks. Did China launch an attack with this particular issue? No, they could have, but no. They were committing espionage. So they know far more about us than we want them to know. The other thing the security office has to worry about, believe it or not, is, are we hiring workers from North Korea? particularly during COVID and shortly after, North Korea was trying to place their workers in organizations working remotely. They had came in to the organization looking like a US citizen, but they're actually someone from North Korea on the company's network. And they were doing one of three things, if not all three. Earning money for the pushed up worker then turned over to the state, committing espionage, or launching attacks, including ransomware attacks. So with all these things the CISOs have to worry about, they honestly never get a good night's sleep. So when you're a CISO of a company with 30,000 employees, and you get this one employee's request to enable an accommodation, the easiest thing to do for that CISO to do is to say no. And when you hear that no, it's most likely coming from the security office. How do we address this as users who need accommodations? Well, first, let's ask ourselves, how does a CISO measure risk? For that, I'm going to send you to Cybersecurity College to learn a few important terms. The first term is risk, and we're all familiar with risk, the potential for loss, damage, network intrusions, and so forth when the threat exploits a weakness, or as we call it in the cybersecurity field, vulnerability. One of the key measuring sticks is something called likelihood. What's the okay, we've identified the risk and the threat. What's the likelihood of that threat actually impacting our organization? If you live in Kansas, the likelihood of a tornado is pretty high. I'm guessing if you live in Kansas, the likelihood of it, if you live in Alaska, excuse me, if you live in Alaska, the likelihood of a tornado is pretty low. Then you have to look at impact. If this threat should actually happen, if we should actually experience an attack, what is the impact to our organization? Is it small? For example, let's say a hacker gets into a hospital network and steals 5 patient records. Well, it's hard for those 5 patients, but for the hospital that might have 50,000 patients, it's no big deal. After we look at the likelihood and the impact, we then come up with the risk score or the threat score. And that risk score tells the security office where to rank the threats to the organization and how to respond to them. Let's look at a couple of examples. Portland, Maine, which is where I live. What's the likelihood of a hurricane hitting Portland? You wouldn't think we'd have hurricanes up here, but we do once in a great while. The likelihood is low, but we have to address the impact as high, simply because if it should happen, you need to be able to respond to it. Fortunately, well, if you want to call it fortunately, we are well versed in protecting ourselves from northeastern storms, windstorms, king tides, flooding events, and so forth. So since we have all those defenses in place, we are prepared for a hurricane. But now let's look at Miami, Florida. What is the likelihood of a hurricane hitting Miami? Pretty darn high, isn't it? And what would the impact be? Can you even imagine? Miami is at sea level, even parts of it are under sea level. So if they got direct hit by a Category 4 or Category 5 hurricane, they would be in a world of hurt. Therefore, by doing this risk assessment, this risk score, this tells the city they need to devote a great deal of resources to prepare for a hurricane. Okay, now let's talk about the risks that are applied, the risk that apply to our accommodations request. A Bluetooth risk, for example. What is the risk of Bluetooth? Well, Bluetooth communications between devices, hearing aid in your phone, or keyboard in your laptop could be intercepted. Now, the attacker would have to be fairly close by and just capture that conversation. But it is likely, it is possible. Probably something that's more dangerous is the idea of repairing an authentication. In other words, if a telephone system or a hearing aid or a computer have not done a good job of implementing the Bluetooth protocols, it's possible that an attacker could get access to that device, such as a conference speakerphone in the conference room. And from that conference speakerphone, pivot into the company network, where they can do all kinds of nasty stuff, including launching ransomware attacks. There are some famous incidents which I'm going to talk about. One is the Cloud Pets data breach in 2017. These were internet-connected stuffed toys. And parents would buy these stuffed animals and they would use the smartphone to record a message that the toy would play. It could be a lullaby, it could be sweet words, that sort of thing. And then they would put the child to bed with the stuffed toy, and the child would fall asleep listening to this parent's voice coming from the stuffed toy. Pretty cool idea, right? Unfortunately, the company that developed these cloud pets did a very poor job of implementing proper authentication, which enabled unauthorized access to the toys. Think about that for a second. Unauthorized access to stuffed animals that children sleep with. What comes to your mind, right? Worst case scenario, child predators. So when this happened, this really got in the headlines with all the media sources, and parents panicked, and rightfully so. And I believe these stuffed animals were withdrawn from the market. And then there was another vulnerability, same year, 2017, called the Blueborn vulnerability. And this is something I believe that researchers found, where it impacted 8.2 billion devices, Androids, iPhone, Windows, Linux devices. And this vulnerability would allow attackers to penetrate even through air-gapped networks and spread malware between devices. I don't know if an actual attack happened this way, but once the vulnerability was discovered, you better believe it that all the manufacturers quickly introduced patches and system updates to address this vulnerability. Okay, 8 years later, what is the real risk with Bluetooth? Well, I like to think that Bluetooth implementations have improved. And what some of my friends on that slide I showed you earlier have told me is the biggest threat may be an insider attack by an employee. And organizations have to deal with insider threats all the time. At a bank, for example, they have to worry about their employees stealing money. So they have all kinds of controls in place to prevent that. So here's an example where an unethical employee might record a conversation, a sensitive conversation, and then go outside the company and sell it to interested parties. So now let's talk about compensating controls. That's a term we use in cybersecurity to, okay, we have this threat, this vulnerability. What controls can we put in place to address this vulnerability, this risk? Compensating the controls. You have to make it sound complicated. Okay. Here's what you can do that can control the risk. Ensure all wireless devices are current with security updates. And companies should be doing this anyway. Not only Bluetooth devices, but PCs, laptops, servers, everything. They should also continuously scan for raw wireless devices. If someone brings in an unauthorized Bluetooth device or wireless access point, they should have systems in place to detect, hey, something's wrong here. We need to check it out. They should also have tools in place to monitor wireless devices to ensure appropriate use. Another friend mentioned to me that there were workarounds for hearing aid users regarding Bluetooth. And another friend mentioned that she used to work in a secure facility and said that she was not allowed to use Bluetooth or FM, but she was allowed to use infrared in the conference room setting. Huh. I haven't seen infrared in a long while, but that kind of makes sense. It's line of sight. And I assume you would be able to use wired hearing devices, an actual physical cord connecting your hearing aid to the listening device. Now, here's a term that I can't even pronounce. Sensitive compartmented information facility. These are facilities that have been locked down really tight for security. And organizations look for compatible devices that can work within these facilities. As a result, hearing aid manufacturers can provide hearing aids without Bluetooth or additional processing. Which brings up the silly idea of having a hearing aid that you wear at home and a hearing aid that you wear at work. Two different hearing aids. I suppose if that's what it takes. Okay, I wore my tie today because I'm a CISO today. With the controls that I mentioned in place, what's the real risk rating for Bluetooth threats? Here's my assessment. I believe the likelihood of an attack is low, and the impact is low as well. Therefore, the threat score or risk score is low. With my controls in place, I'm going to allow you to use your Bluetooth device. Now let's talk about the risk of enabling captions. And that's a little bit more dicey because what we're talking about here is data privacy. Many of us use CART, we love our CART operators, but it's theoretically possible that CART operators could record our sensitive conversations and get them out to the greater world, sell them, embarrass us, whatever they might want to do. They're not going to do that, but they could. And organizations have to take that risk into an account. Automatic speech recognition services, ASR, such you use in Zoom calls, for example, particularly if you store a transcript. That transcript is stored on what we call a third-party server. That is like Zoom, for example. Zoom stores all our captions and transcripts. Well, we better hope that Zoom has good security controls in place to prevent a data breach from coming inside their network and stealing our conversation. So companies have to do what's called a third-party risk review. Make sure that the companies that they contract with have good security practices in place. The other threat is live captions that are visible to unauthorized participants. Let's say you work remotely. You're tired of the four walls in your house, so you go to the local coffee shop. You're working away, and all of a sudden you get invited to a very important, critical Zoom meeting. You launch a Zoom meeting, you have captions enabled, and you're participating. Someone behind you could walk by and say, "Hey, that's an interesting looking conversation. I'm going to read it behind your shoulder." They may need binoculars to do it, but they could do it. Data privacy risk is real, so what can be done? I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that when I asked for CART services, I got pushback. The issue was my employer was not familiar with CART services. They didn't understand that CART operators are ethically bound not to disclose their conversations. And so I had to train them, educate them on what CART can do. So we ended up doing two things. We signed a confidentiality agreement with the CART operator, and we made sure the client that I was doing a CART engagement with agreed to using CART. With those two controls in place, I was able to use CART in my meetings with clients. So what can be done about data privacy risk? Well, it's really important to use captioning servers as end-to-end encryption so that if the transmission of data from one device to another device gets intercepted, it's all garbage because it's encrypted. We also need to be sure we have non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements with our human captioners. And we want to limit caption visibility to verified participants and train our employees to be very careful about where they use captions. With these controls in place, What does Andy, the CISO, say is the risk rating for caption threats related to data privacy? I have to say low-medium. The reason I have to include medium is because we have to rely on our third parties to keep our data secure, and there's always a risk to that because we do not have direct access to how that third party is protecting our data. Even if an attack should happen, the impact is likely low. So therefore, the threat score is low-medium. I, the CISO, would ask you why you want to use CART. Make sure that all parties have signed the necessary agreements and we're not recording super top secret conversations. But I probably would say don't save transcripts if it's a particularly sensitive conversation. And then I would allow the use of captioning services. When we planned this webinar, Michael and I, he gave me a use case where a new hire with Bluetooth-enabled hearing devices needed to work in a secure facility, which prohibited wireless devices. The employer determined that the device recommended by the audiologist for use in meetings, face-to-face conversations, and for telephone access could not be permitted due to the policy against wireless devices. Ooh, that's pretty strict. And then I learned we're probably talking about a top secret secure facility that has access to classified data. And unfortunately, classified data is a whole different ballgame because the government has very strict requirements around classified data. Remember that term I introduced earlier that I can't pronounce? Sensitive something something information facility, SCIF? These are highly secure areas that have really been locked down security-wise. And they make sure that all the devices they allow in are properly secured. And it typically means no wireless devices, no smartphones, and so forth. When I learned about this use case, I said, uh-oh, we have a problem because we're dealing with classified data. There's a couple of things to think about here. I've had several people tell me who used to work in the government that much data marked classified really shouldn't be marked classified. The thing is, by keeping data classified, it's kind of a form of power. I know something, but you don't. And truth be told, when CISOs say yes to an accommodation request, they could be putting their careers at risk. So they want to say no because they just don't want to take that risk. But here's something I found out I thought was very interesting as I was preparing for this webinar. It turns out the National Security Agency, NSA, is trying to advance accessibility. The National Security Agency is probably the top agency we have in this country in regards to security controls. And they're trying. They provide automatic captioning in the auditorium, which is great because both hearing people and non-hearing people can use that. They are testing secure text, speech-to-text, and text-to-speech apps. And they are working with third parties to develop assistive technologies that meet security requirements, including headsets and digital adapters. Wow, fantastic. If you go to nasa.gov and look at the FAQ page, you will find all kinds of good information about what they do for accommodation. In fact, on that page, they have an email address to which you can submit accommodation request. Okay, me, being the nosy person that I am, sent them an email back in April. I've not received a response. And by the way, if there's anybody on this webinar that is employed by NSA, please get a hold of me. As always, I start my accommodation request or information request with politeness. I first address the fact that I understand the NSA has some unique challenges, and they have to be very, very careful about allowing unique devices, such as those that I need to use. But the truth is, unless you allow the accommodations that I need, I would be hard-pressed to satisfy my job duties. And then I asked in the email, if you can do so without risk, could you provide me a summary of how NSA deals with this quandary, this need for accommodations versus this need for security? As I said, I've not received a response. But the key point here is, if the NSA is trying to allow accommodation to provide access, why can't other government agencies do as well? What we need to do when we are dealing with organizations that are resistant to our accommodation request is have a polite conversation. And we should involve not only the security office, but human resources as well. And when you have that meeting with all the parties, be sure to bring donuts, as that puts everyone in a good mood. Ask the security office, what data systems are being secured? And each of these different categories of data have unique requirements. Is it PPI, protected private information, which typically refers to consumer financial data, bank accounts, social security numbers, financial statements, and that sort of thing? Or is it healthcare data? We're all familiar with HIPAA. Or is it sensitive confidential organization data, such as business plans, merger plans, staff reduction plans, and so forth? The organization determines that is sensitive. If it's any of those three categories, we can address the security risks around our accommodation requests. I've done it throughout my career. It can be done. But is it classified data? Then we may have a problem. I've never worked with a government agency. I've never had to deal with classified data, so I'm not exactly sure how this is accommodated. But I would ask the security office, gently ask them, I know you don't want me to use this device or this accommodation, but I'd like to ask, have you conducted a formal risk review regarding my request? Or did you say nowhere to have it? If they did perform a formal risk review, let's ask if we can see the results, because they may have made some assumptions that are not true. If they have not done a formal risk review, perhaps Human Resources, HR, could gently probe the security office to conduct a risk review. And it's possible that once they conduct that risk review, they may see the security implications of your accommodation request are not that serious, and therefore will allow it. What we need to do is work collaboratively, not adversarially. And once you start talking ADA, section 504, 508, whatever, then you're just locking people up in their positions. We need to think that we need to realize that we are a team that needs to work together. Can all parties come to an agreed upon solution for accommodation? And finally, if the National Security Agency is trying, why can't we? This concludes my presentation. If you stuck around this long, thank you so much. If you would like to reach out and stay in touch with me, this is how you can do it. And if you would like for me to speak to your HLAA group or any other group, please let me know at that email address. Thanks again. I'll turn this over to Michael.
Yeah, well done, Andy. Really good presentation, and thank you so much for putting so much thought and preparation. I know I have reviewed several versions as you were improving with each version, so just want to say thank you for great information presented. So it looks like we've got a few comments and questions from the audience here. So first one that I'd like to just highlight is from a gentleman named Jonathan, and he wishes all of us a happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day. I thought that was really good to know that is today. He also made a comment on how, just reading here, requesting accommodation, does the problem lie within its role and the ability for companies to afford those accommodations? We understand the challenges, but work with us, not get rid of us. Sometimes the companies have tools, but the HR or ADA just may not be aware of it. Anything you would like to maybe comment on that, Andy?
Yes, that's a great question and a great point. I remember when my organization first implemented Microsoft Teams. This was during COVID. I noticed that some people had the option to see captioning and some did not. And I was the one who did not have that option. So I emailed IT to ask them to please turn it on. IT, as overwhelmed as they are, emailed me back and said, "Oh, we can't do that." So then I gently asked my HR office if they could step in. That afternoon, those captions are turned on. It's often just a matter of all parties realizing what is actually available and taking the time to step back from the busy stuff of the day and say, okay, how can we meet this request? And, honestly, 90% of the time it can be done. Do we need a data agreement with the provider? There's ways to work around it, but you have to have that conversation. And ideally, you involve IT, security, HR, and the party that needs accommodation. And usually the accommodations are not expensive. What blows my mind is they'll pay your employee tens of thousands of dollars to work for them, but they won't spend $2,000 for an accommodation request. That just doesn't make sense. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. This next question, I think, is a really interesting one. You mentioned about Bluetooth having some security concerns. Does that also apply for telecoil, or is telecoil considered more scam proof or safer than Bluetooth? What's your perspective on that?
That would be something to have to look up and do research on. I suspect telecore is not targeted as much by cybercriminal organizations because it's not as widespread as Bluetooth. The funny thing about Bluetooth is there's far more hearing people using Bluetooth than there are of hard of hearing people with all those AirPods. So Bluetooth is the target that the scammers are going after. As for telecoil, that's interesting. You'd have to, I would think that because it's limited to the room it's in, if you're sitting outside the room, outside that circle, you can't hear the transmission. So I would think it'd be okay, but I would definitely have to look it up and see what other parties say about that.
Thank you. Yeah, for those that are here live, we're going to send a recording after this, and any questions that we need to follow up on or what have you, we'll send that along with the recording and post it on the website. So know that we'll do everything we can to help with that. Andy, Jonathan, who asked the first question and wished us a happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day, he wanted to say hello. He remembers you from the public speaking that you did with the Hearing Loss New England recently. So thank you again for all that you do on education and presenting to so many around the nation, if not the world. Okay, so the next question that we have here is, I have also had pushback on card captioning access in real time. Do you have a link to the agreement that CART has to sign to be hired? She's looked for them and has not found them, meaning the agreement for confidentiality. And I think probably what that might be would be like a non-disclosure agreement or anything of that nature. Andy, are you able to comment on that or respond?
Well, any company worth the salt is going to have a confidentiality agreement in their files that they send to the third parties, to the vendors, to the contractors. So they should be able to use that same confidentiality agreement with cart operators as well. Do I know of a place where you can download one? No, I don't. But even if I did, it still would have to go through company review. No company is going to take an agreement and say, sure, you can use it. Everything has to go through the lawyers, right? But to answer the question, that company should already have an NDA that they can provide the cart operator.
Yeah. Well said, and I can definitely attest to that. In my previous companies that I've worked for, they all have their standard approved non-disclosure agreements, and that has to go through what my company would call the corporate general counsel or the legal department. They will have their own templates, and they absolutely will need to review it if it's through your place of employment, which is especially the non-disclosure agreement. Okay, so this next question for you, Andy, is now that we are back working in the office setting in person, what accommodations have you asked for in person events besides car captioning? Or aware of those others that might have returned to the office in person?
Good question. And I just can speak to my own experience. Fortunately, these days, we rarely talk on the phone anymore, don't we? But I did get approval to use a caption type phone, caption call, and some of the others out there. But so rarely do you do business on the phone that I ever actually need to use it. But it was available if I needed to have a conversation on the phone. Most conversations took place via Teams or Zoom. And what's funny about hybrid meetings, I would go into a hybrid meeting, I'd be there in person, but then I would take my phone and mute it, turn the speaker off, so I could see the captions on my phone while participating in the meeting in person. So that's another great way to stay connected with to be with your peers as opposed to being at home or stuck in your cube. So those are the ideas that come to mind.
Yeah, good. All right, another question just came through. If you were to request an accommodation and the HR or ADA ask for your hearing test results from your audiologist,
That's a good question, and I don't want to answer it because that's kind of going into the law, healthcare, HIPAA type area. I certainly would have questions about providing it. But again, I don't know if the need to determine reasonable accommodations versus a need to protect your health data, which one overrides it. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
no worries, thank you. And then this next one is, you talked a lot about the emotional triggers of fear, hope, and obligation in scams. I know I certainly have seen some of those text messages, and it certainly elicits that emotional reaction like, wow. So in your view, what are some simple, accessible strategies that people with hearing loss can use to avoid falling for these?
Again, don't react in the moment. I said, if you feel your heart going like this, like you're having a heart attack, that should be a sign to you and say, wait a minute, stop, stop, stop. Let's breathe. Let's step back. Let's think it through. The last thing you want to do is react in that moment. And that's true for hard of hearing people, deaf people. It doesn't matter what your hearing is. Emotional triggers, we all have them. And the key is to recognize them and train our brain to say, wait a minute, when I have that feeling, especially if it comes from an unknown sender, that should be a sign to us to calm our emotions down and trigger our brain. It's really all you can do.
I think that's great advice. Thank you, Andy. This next question that we have here is, in your view, what's the biggest myth that still needs to be busted when it comes to cybersecurity and assistive technologies like Bluetooth and hearing aids?
The captions don't seem to be working for me here. Could you repeat that question, please?
Yeah, of course. In your view, what's the biggest myth that still needs to be busted when it comes to cybersecurity and assistive technologies like Bluetooth and hearing aids?
I didn't catch the word that you used at the beginning. I'm so sorry. This is how reliant I am on captions. What was that word
Oh,
you used?
no worries. Let me put it into the chat box for you.
Yeah.
Maybe that question will, I'll just copy and paste it from the Q&A here. 1 second.
Or how do you find roll devices on your phone or iPad? Is that the question?
Yeah, the question was, what's the biggest myth
What
that
biggest
still
myth?
needs to be busted, meaning we need to correct the misperception
Mm.
when it comes to cybersecurity and assistive technologies?
Wow, that's a great question. Now I need to think about that. I'll probably write about that in my next Substack blog article. The biggest myth. I think the biggest myth that people have, and doesn't have to do with the cyber, is that by asking for an accommodation, you're making yourself look weak, that you can't do the job other people are doing. That's just no. I wear glasses. I wear hearing aids. Whatever I need to do to be able to participate. It's not I'm disadvantaged. I'm using these tools, so I won't be disadvantaged. And it doesn't really have anything to do with cyber. It's just a matter of people's perception. And that's the myth we need to destroy. I'm not any different than you and maybe doing the work. I just need this or that. I
Yeah.
don't know if that answers the question, but I'm going to think more on that later.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely does. Yeah, and I think this was the question that you might have seen in the chat box here as well
Mhm.
is, how do you find rogue devices on your phone or iPad?
There are apps you can download to either device where it scans for wireless devices. And when you turn these, you'll be amazed how many there are out there. It's been a while since I've used one, so I can't make any recommendations. But they're free, they're easy to use. Just make sure you're using an authorized app and not a virus landing type app. And they'll see all the network IDs, even if not broadcasted in network ID. So that's how you kind of find it out.
Perfect. And I just put this also in the chat box directly to you, Andy. So this next question is, you mentioned how policies at secure facilities can unintentionally exclude people with disabilities. And there was quite a few people that commented throughout the webinar about how they were personally discriminated intentionally or unintentionally. So what are some best practices that you can share for balancing, accessibility and security in those particular environments?
The best thing you can do is have that conversation. Find out why they are saying no. Make sure they've got some so-called justified reason to say no, as opposed to just saying no out of habit. And then ask for that proof or ask for that documentation. And then review it, maybe review it with HR and say, you know what, they're making some assumptions here that are not true. Can we talk about this policy? Can we adjust this policy? Can we rewrite it in such a way that the accommodations can be allowed? But the key point is you have to understand why they're saying no, examine the evidence, examine the policies and the documents. Most of the time, you're going to see reasons that are no longer valid in 2025. The problem with cybersecurity, and security in general, is something that happened 10 years ago, a major security event. They still think about that 10 years later, even though that threat no longer exists thanks to all the new technology we have and all the defenses we have in place. So what we need to do again is just examine the evidence, make sure you understand the perspective, and then come up with your own perspective as why this policy should be waived.
Yeah, well said. And I just put in another question here for you directly in the chat box. This one is, can you walk us through how organizations should assess risk, specifically for accessibility tools like live captioning or Bluetooth devices, without overreacting?
They should assess risk for the same way they assess risk for a new operating system or a new server they're putting into the network. It's just another technology device. And whatever risk criteria they use for a new cloud service, for example, they should apply that same criteria to your accommodation request. There's nothing special about Bluetooth, telecoil, whatever have you, that makes it different than any other device a company might use. It just simply needs to go through the same risk review that these other devices do. And again, get away from the security office just saying no because they're not familiar with it.
And I think we're down to the last 4 minutes, so I'm gonna just get one more question here that just popped in as well, is how does Bluetooth and your hearing aids put you at risk?
I don't think it does in today's age. I mean, I'm not worried about someone taking over my Bluetooth device. Um, if they're going to try something, they have to get close enough to me to see them. And let me think this through. So if someone, yeah, I just don't see that happening. I mean, again, scammers go after the big targets. People wearing Bluetooth hearing aids, they're not that big of a market, big of a target market. And plus, many of these scammers live overseas in East Asia, and so they can't get close to you to launch a Bluetooth attack. But that's something I'll look up after this conversation, but I don't really think there's any real risk to having Bluetooth-enabled hearing aids.
Well, thank you, Andy. I think that's about all the time that we have for the Q&A. Just want to say thank you again so much for your time today. And I also want to just summarize a lot of comments that I saw in the chat and Q&A about how much they enjoyed your presentation, Andy, and how good the content was. So just want to say thank you. It really means a lot to us and those attendees here on the webinar. So I want to say thank you again. Now I'm going to turn it back over to our amazing HLAA partners, Melissa, to help wrap us up.
Yes, thank you, Andy. Thank you, Michael. Thank you both for such an amazing presentation. Thank you to Lisa, our wonderful cart person who's here providing the cart services today. And just wanted to remind everyone that the webinar was recorded and will be up on our website fairly shortly. And as Michael said, please sign up for e-news and our alerts so you can hear about other webinars, other things that we're doing. And thank you for being a part of it.